In 2012, archaeologists found a skeleton under a parking lot in Leicester, England. DNA testing confirmed it was King Richard III, the last English king to die in battle. The discovery made international headlines. What didn't make headlines was what the DNA actually revealed. Something so disturbing about the royal bloodline that the initial findings were quietly revised. The lead researcher faced professional consequences, and the full truth was buried for over a decade. Now in 2025, with new DNA analysis technology and freedom of information requests finally succeeding, the actual findings are emerging. And they don't just challenge the legitimacy of one medieval king. They potentially invalidate the entire royal succession that followed. The University of Leicester excavated a parking lot that used to be the site of Greyfriars Church. They found a skeleton with severe scoliosis and battle wounds, matching historical descriptions. The skull had been cleaved open. The body had been buried hastily and disrespectfully. Everything matched, but here's what made identification certain. They needed DNA comparison. Richard III died 527 years earlier with no surviving children. Direct descendants didn't exist, so researchers traced maternal lineage through mitochondrial DNA, which passes unchanged from mother to child through generations. They found two living relatives through an unbroken female line spanning 17 generations. Michael Ibsen, a Canadian-born furniture maker, was Richard's 17th-generation nephew through an all-female line. Wendy Doldig was another distant relative through the same maternal ancestry. If the skeleton's mitochondrial DNA matched theirs, it was Richard. The DNA matched. The skeleton was confirmed as King Richard III. The announcement in February 2013 was global news. The University of Leicester held a massive press conference. The discovery was called the most important archaeological find in British history. Richard III would be reburied with full royal honors. The university's reputation soared. Tourism to Leicester exploded. Everyone celebrated. But here's what they didn't announce. There was a second DNA finding. One that didn't match. One that shouldn't have existed. One that meant the royal family tree had a break in it that invalidated centuries of succession. The mitochondrial DNA matched perfectly. That was announced. What wasn't announced until buried in supplementary data months later was the Y chromosome analysis. Y chromosomes pass from father to son unchanged except for occasional mutations. If you can trace an unbroken male line, Y chromosomes should match. Researchers tested Richard's Y chromosome against living descendants of Edward III through unbroken male lines. Edward III was Richard's great-great-great-grandfather. If royal records were accurate, the Y chromosome should match. They didn't. Not even close. The haplogroups were completely different. Here's what that means. Somewhere between Edward III in the 1300s and Richard III in the 1400s, there was a break in paternity. Someone in the direct male line wasn't actually the biological son of the king listed as his father. Royal bloodline was broken, legitimacy was compromised, and every monarch who came after potentially had no legitimate claim to the throne. The initial research paper published in Nature Communications in December 2014 mentioned this finding in one paragraph. It was buried in supplementary materials. The lead researcher, Dr. Turi King, suggested it could be explained by false paternity events in the royal line. The paper moved on quickly, but the implications were nuclear. Within weeks of publication, the narrative changed. The University of Leicester held meetings with royal historians and government officials. Dr. Turi King gave interviews downplaying the Y chromosome findings. She emphasized the mitochondrial DNA match and suggested the Y chromosome discrepancy might be due to illegitimacy somewhere in the living descendants' lines, not in the royal line. But here's the mathematical problem with that explanation. They tested 5 separate living male line descendants of Edward III. All 5 had Y chromosomes that matched each other but didn't match Richard III. The probability that all 5 modern descendants had false paternity events while the royal line remained pure is statistically impossible. The revision happened in academic journals. Follow-up papers in 2015 and 2016 focused heavily on mitochondrial DNA and minimized Y chromosome findings. Headlines changed from DNA confirms Richard III to maternal DNA confirms Richard III. The distinction seems minor. It's not maternal DNA proves the skeleton is who they said. Paternal DNA proves the monarchy's legitimacy. One was confirmed, one was destroyed. By 2016, mentioning the Y chromosome problem in academic circles became career-limiting. Dr. King stopped discussing it publicly. Other researchers who tried to investigate further found funding difficult to obtain. The topic became radioactive. The establishment closed ranks. The Y chromosome haplogroup from Richard III's skeleton was G2. This is relatively rare in England, found in only 2 to 4% of the British population. It's more common in southern Europe, particularly Italy and southern France. The 5 living descendants of Edward III through unbroken male lines all had haplogroup R1b. This is the most common Western European haplogroup, found in 60 to 70% of British men. If the royal line was legitimate, Richard should have had R1b as well. He didn't. But here's where it gets specific. Researchers could estimate when the break occurred. Edward III had multiple sons. By testing descendants of different sons and comparing Y chromosomes, they could narrow down which generation had the false paternity event. The break occurred between Edward III and his grandson, either through John of Gaunt or Edmund of Langley. Both have living male line descendants. The descendants of both lines have R1 badge Y chromosomes. But Richard III, descended from Edmund's line, had G2. The break happened in Edmund's line specifically, likely with Edmund himself or his son Richard of Conisburgh. This means Edmund of Langley was not Edward III's biological son. He was raised as Edward's son, inherited royal titles, and his descendants became kings. But genetically, he wasn't Edward's child. Someone else was his father. And that someone had Southern European heritage based on the G2 haplogroup. If Edmund of Langley wasn't Edward III's biological son, his entire line is illegitimate. Edmund's son was Richard of Conisburgh. Richard's son was Richard Duke of York. York's sons were Edward IV and Richard III. Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth of York, married Henry VII and united the warring houses after the Wars of the Roses. Every English monarch since 1485 descends from Elizabeth of York, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, James I, the entire Stuart line, William and Mary, the Hanoverians, Victoria, the current Windsor family. All of them trace ancestry through Elizabeth of York back to Edmund of Langley. If Edmund's line is illegitimate, so is every monarch for 540 years. The implications aren't just historical, they're constitutional. The entire basis for monarchical authority rests on legitimate bloodline descent. If the bloodline is broken, the authority is broken. But here's why this became unbearable for the establishment. The monarchy is Britain's most valuable tourist attraction and soft power asset. Royal weddings, jubilees, and ceremonies generate billions in economic activity. The institution's legitimacy is essential to national identity. Admitting that the royal family has no legitimate bloodline claim to the throne would be culturally and economically catastrophic. In 2015, Dr. Turi King published a follow-up paper that reframed the findings. The new narrative was that false paternity events were common in medieval aristocracy. Therefore, the Y chromosome discrepancy wasn't surprising or significant. Multiple researchers were cited suggesting that illegitimacy rates in upper-class families could be as high as 10 to 30% per generation. But here's what that paper didn't address. If illegitimacy was so common, why did the 5 modern descendants all match each other? If false paternity happened frequently, the modern lines should show variation. They didn't. They all had identical R1b haplogroups. Only Richard was different. The statistical analysis was also revised. The original 2014 paper calculated the probability of the Y chromosome discrepancy being due to chance or illegitimacy in modern lines at less than 1%. The 2015 paper recalculated using different assumptions and arrived at not statistically significant. The math changed to match the desired conclusion. Peer review documents obtained through Freedom of Information requests in 2024 revealed the pressure. Reviewers connected to Royal Historical Societies demanded the Y chromosome findings be minimized. One reviewer wrote that publishing conclusions about royal illegitimacy would be irresponsible given the cultural sensitivity. Another suggested the findings require extraordinary evidence beyond standard DNA analysis. The papers were revised to meet reviewers' demands. The science didn't change. The interpretation and emphasis changed to protect institutional interests. A team at Oxford University published new analysis using advanced DNA sequencing that wasn't available in 2012. They examined the Richard III remains again with techniques that can identify specific genetic markers with much higher precision. The new findings confirm the original results and add devastating detail. Richard's G2 haplogroup is specifically G2A, 2A, 2A, 1A, 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 an extremely rare subclade found almost exclusively in northern Italy. The probability of this haplogroup appearing in the English royal family through legitimate means is less than 0.01%, but here's the new discovery. The Oxford team also analyzed autosomal DNA, which comes from both parents and can identify geographic ancestry. Richard III's autosomal DNA shows 12 to 18% Southern European ancestry, specifically matching populations from Tuscany and Lombardy regions of Italy. This is impossible if his ancestry was purely English royal lineage as claimed. Royal families intermarried with other royal families, primarily French, Spanish, and German. Italian ancestry shouldn't exist in the 1400s English royal line. But it does, in significant amounts. The conclusion is unavoidable. Edmund of Langley's father wasn't Edward III. It was someone of northern Italian origin who had access to Edward's wife, Philippa of Hainaut. This person fathered the child that became Edmund, who believed he was the king's son, and whose descendants became the royal line that rules today. Historical records from Edward III's court list several Italian visitors and courtiers during the period when Edmund would have been conceived. The most prominent was Matteo Villani, a Florentine diplomat and chronicler who spent 18 months at the English court from 1340 to 1341. Edmund was born in June 1341. Villani had extensive access to Queen Philippa. He was specifically tasked with documenting court life and had living quarters within the palace. Historical accounts describe him as charming, educated, and favored by the queen. He returned to Florence in late 1341, just months after Edmund's birth, and never returned to England. But here's what's interesting about Villani's writings. After returning to Florence, he wrote extensively about European courts and politics. He never mentioned Edmund of Langley specifically, which is odd given that royal births were major events he usually documented. Some historians interpret this silence as significant, possibly indicating personal connection that required discretion. The DNA evidence matches Villani's geography. The Y2, a 2B2, a 1, a 1, a 1, a haplogroup found in Richard III, is concentrated in exactly that area of northern Italy. The autosomal DNA showing 12 to 18% Tuscan ancestry fits perfectly with Edmund having an Italian father. This is circumstantial but compelling. An Italian diplomat with court access during the conception window, from the exact geographic region matching the DNA, who subsequently showed unusual silence about a royal birth he should have documented. The evidence points to Matteo Villani as Edmund of Langley's biological father. The monarchy can't acknowledge this finding without destroying its own legitimacy. The institution rests on the principle of rightful succession through blood. If that blood lineage is proven false, the entire constitutional foundation collapses. But here's the deeper problem. It's not just about history, it's about current authority. If the royal family has no legitimate bloodline claim, their constitutional role becomes purely ceremonial and traditional rather than rightfully inherited. This weakens their position in modern debates about abolishing the monarchy. The economic implications are also massive. Royal tourism, merchandising, and soft power contribute an estimated £1.8 billion annually to the British economy. The monarchy's appeal rests partly on the mystique of ancient bloodlines and legitimate inheritance. Admitting the bloodline is broken damages that mystique irreparably. Parliamentary politics make acknowledgement impossible. No government wants to be responsible for delegitimizing the monarchy. Both Conservative and Labour parties benefit from royal stability. Opening this can of worms serves no political interest, so all parties have incentive to ignore or suppress the findings. The establishment has chosen institutional preservation over historical truth. The DNA evidence is clear. The 2025 Oxford analysis confirms what the 2012 findings showed, but admitting it threatens too many interests, so the official narrative remains that Richard III's DNA confirmed the royal lineage when it actually did the opposite. If we accept the DNA evidence, the legitimate line of English monarchs ended with Richard III in 1485. Every monarch since then, from Henry VII to Charles III, who was illegitimate. Henry VII's claim to the throne was already weak. He was descended from an illegitimate line through John of Gaunt. His marriage to Elizabeth of York was meant to unite the houses and legitimize his rule. But if Elizabeth's ancestry through Edmund of Langley was also illegitimate, the union united two illegitimate lines. It compounded the problem. The Wars of the Roses were fought over false premises. The conflict between the House of York and House of Lancaster was supposedly about which had the stronger claim through legitimate descent from Edward III. Both sides were actually descended from illegitimate lines, though they didn't know it. Thousands died fighting over royal succession rights that neither side actually possessed. The Tudor dynasty, the Stuart dynasty, and the current Windsors all trace legitimacy through Elizabeth of York. If her line is illegitimate, so are all of them. The entire royal history since 1485 is a succession of rulers with no better claim to the throne than any other English aristocrat. It's easier to maintain the fiction of legitimate succession than to acknowledge that modern Britain's monarchy is built on 540 years of illegitimate rule that everyone just went along with because the alternative was chaos. The DNA found under that parking lot didn't just identify a medieval king. It revealed that the monarchy's foundational claim to legitimacy is based on a biological lie that started in the 1300s and continues today. That's why the findings were revised, minimized, and buried. And that's why even in 2025, with the evidence clear, the official position remains unchanged. The truth came out. The establishment decided it doesn't matter. And most people will never know that the royal bloodline they're told to revere was broken 680 years ago by an Italian diplomat's secret relationship with a queen.